Well, all right the way through this crisis, the UK government, led by Boris Johnson, has been dissembling, deflecting, and actually lying about their handling of the crisis, about the nature of the problem, and about, as you say, the number of deaths in care homes. And with very few exceptions, British journalists have failed to answer the cutting questions to get at the truth. And the daily press briefings that this government's been holding to update the country on coronavirus and how they're dealing with it have been an exercise in theatre, the theatre of the absurd. And where you do have journalists who are willing to be more aggressive and demand the truth, then those journalists have found that their programmes have been boycotted by British cabinet ministers. So this is a scandal within a scandal. We have a crisis of leadership within the bigger crisis of a global pandemic in its British form, and we have a crisis of our journalism who are failing to hold leaders and the powerful to account, and indeed are just stenographers. They're just taking whatever they're fed by government ministers, asking very softball questions because they need to retain access. So it's a very worst crisis, and it's landed on the lap of the very worst government we've had. This is a government of rogues, of right-wing ideologues who care very little for the truth. And journalism, the journalists in this country, certainly the mainstream journalists, have been allowing them to get away with it. Because the government's not released those figures, it was pushed into releasing the figures of the people who've died in care homes, and that was after much controversy over the rising death toll in care homes, and that was being flagged up by people working in care homes, whereby old people were being discharged from hospitals to free up capacity within the NHS and taken and put into care homes without being tested for COVID-19, and then they were infecting other residents of the care home, and it was running right through the care home sector, turning them into veritable death camps. So I don't know how many, but it could be many thousands, because we know that there is a disconnect between the official figure of deaths, which is over 40,000 in the UK, and the unofficial figures, which has been arrived at by such newspapers as the Financial Times, which is a major newspaper in this country, and also by the ONS. It's put the figure at over 60,000. So in between, there'll be thousands of those who have died at home in the most horrific circumstances, on their own, isolated and lonely. It's a real crime, and it's a real scandal. And hopefully once this is over, there will be some kind of political reckoning, if not criminal, in my view. So obviously lockdown brings with it its own issues, its own health issues, mental health issues, people who live alone, who are old aged, who don't have any support, don't have any family, are cut off from their communities and their neighbourhoods. They're going to suffer grievously. There have been attempts to forge community response units, volunteer groups to try and minister to these people, but there will be people who've fallen through the cracks. So many people will have died as a consequence of lockdown itself. There have been a lot of people who will have died because of other illnesses and diseases, i.e. cancer treatments cancelled, people not going to the hospital because the message originally from the British government was stay at home and protect the NHS. So people that need help, need conventional operations, have heart attacks and so forth, they could die as a consequence of lockdown for failing to go to the hospital. So there is a whole string of problems that has arisen out of the coronavirus crisis, and how Britain was so woefully, grievously and criminally underprepared to meet this crisis, and this in service to an ideology of free market fanaticism, which holds that only anything that makes money now in the here and now is worthy of pursuing, and any kind of contingency planning and resources that do not make a profit now, that are there for the service of the community, those things are a waste. We know that there was an exercise called Cygnus that was undertaken by NHS England in 2016 to wargame the scenario of an epidemic, a hypothetical influenza epidemic, and the results were so shocking that the government of the day, the Tory government led by Theresa May, suppressed the results, because the recommendations were that this country needed to immediately gear up on personal protective equipment, ventilators, and increase capacity in the NHS, which has been underfunded in service to austerity over the last 10 years in response to the 2008 financial crash. So 10 years of Tory cuts to the public service, including the NHS, left this country vulnerable and naked in the face of a global pandemic, which was entirely expected by most members of the medical community, both at home and abroad. Again, criminal negligence has typified this government's response. Well, the truth is coming out now in the midst of the crisis, but what the government's trying to do is forge some kind of national consensus about the need to fight the coronavirus and that criticism should not be too harsh because it would undermine the national effort. And this is their way of trying to deflect the responsibility for the size of the crisis in Britain. I will remind you that we have the highest death rate per population in the entire world. That is not a league table that any self-respecting country or government would like to be the top of, but we are the top of this league table. They will do their best to sweep their handling of the crisis under the carpet. They will try and, as I say, maintain this false national consensus. They do have 5 years left in power. They have an 80-seat majority in Parliament, so the chances of the government being removed before the end of its term are very slim at this juncture. But I hope that as more and more evidence comes to light of the nature of this government's handling of the crisis, the incompetence, the negligence, the lies, the dissembling, that more and more of its own supporters will begin to turn on it, and in the media will find a backbone by which to start holding the government to account, which is, after all, is the role of the media in any self-respecting and self-regarding democracy. So I'm hoping it wouldn't be years, but certainly we have to wait till we get through the other side of this crisis. It's probably not the best time to replace the government, but certainly it should be held to account, the government and its members and all those who've been complicit in trying to pull the wool over the eyes of the British subjects, the British people. Edward R. Murrow, the great American campaigning journalist of the 1950s and 60s, once said, and I quote, "A nation of sheep will beget a government of wolves." And we do have in this country in 2020 a government of wolves, because we are a nation of sheep. We've been sheepified, if I can plough a neologism, by years and years of media bombardment, of propaganda, which is all being undertaken to try and achieve this kind of understanding within the minds of and hearts and minds of the British people that this is the best of all possible worlds. And now we're starting to learn that it certainly is not. Well, this exposes the rotten foundations of the British state. Britain, which is a country that's never done on boasting how great it is, how great its history is, the important role it plays on the world stage, has been exposed as a third-rate power masquerading as a first-rate power. A country's power is not measured by the number of aircraft carriers it has, the number of missiles it has, its GDP, the number of billionaires that live in the country. Is measured by how it treats the most vulnerable in its society. And we have a government that worships at the altar of a free market ideology under which people are reduced to economic units. Their worth measured by how much they can contribute, how much wealth they can gain, how much tax they can pay. And so under that metric, the weak and the vulnerable, the old age, those who are sick, who can't work, who can't produce, who can't contribute to society in terms of tax, in terms of man hours, they're seen as surplus to requirements. And that was the government's policy at the start of this crisis. They were going to follow a policy initially of what they call herd immunity, which means just like the virus run through the community, it'll take away the weakest, but the strong will develop a natural immunity and the economy will be able to function as normal. Every word, every action taken at the start of this crisis by this Boris Johnson-led government was taken with the economy, not public health, in mind. We know that this country locked down too late and too little, and the damage was done prior to lockdown. We didn't lock down here until the 23rd of March. This despite the fact that it was on the 11th of February that the WHO declared that COVID-19 was a public health emergency of international concern, and on the 11th of March declared it a global pandemic. In those vital 3 weeks, the government did absolutely nothing, allowing the virus to run right through the country. They didn't stop flights coming in from all parts of the world. They didn't stop movement. They didn't stop mass gatherings. And the result is there to see. Thousands of avoidable, unnecessary deaths have been the result. And this is because, as I say, this government doesn't care about public health. It cares about public wealth. That's the metric by which they judge the success of their society. And Britain, I have to tell you, is not a pleasant society to be in after 40 years of Tory party ideology dominating the country's every waking moment in its culture, in its economy, and how it invests in public health and public sector, in the public sector in general.
And is the UK heading towards a second wave of infections?
There's a very strong chance of that. We know that the WHO has warning of a second wave because without a vaccine, then coronavirus has not been defeated. Only those countries that have locked down hard and heavy have managed to get on top of the virus. Countries such as South Korea, countries such as New Zealand, such as Taiwan, Singapore, but countries that failed to lock down soon enough have suffered huge damage in terms of public health. But there has been an easing of the lockdown. We've seen a wave of protest, understandable, on the issue of Black Lives Matter in response to the vile murder of George Floyd by a cop in Minneapolis recently. And so there's a worry that that's going to spread the virus again. I do get the sense that a lot of people are tired of lockdown. They're tired of restrictions to their normal life. People are worried about their jobs. People are worried about their businesses. And I see a lot of people who are now failing to comply with social distancing. And a lot of people, as I say, are now starting to visit friends, are now starting to go out. It's summer here, the weather's better. So it's been very hard to maintain. But the single factor that has destroyed lockdown and has turned it into a joke in this country is because Boris Johnson's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, his brain, has been uncovered as breaking the lockdown himself, a policy that he helped to set with the government. A few weeks ago, he travelled over 300 miles to go and visit his father, his family, and to spend some time on their farm in the countryside in the north of England. And he didn't even apologise for that, much less resign. The government extended a lot of political capital in defending him. So anybody now feels that they have licence to do the same. People who've been denied the right to see their parents, grandparents, who haven't been able to attend funerals of loved ones, weddings, see siblings, they've all sacrificed because they were told that was their public social duty. And here we have the government's chief advisor doing exactly that, and he hasn't been forced to pay a price. He hasn't been held to account. So it's a real scandal, and that, as I say, all feeds into the very strong likelihood that there will be a second wave. I don't think there's any going back to the pre-coronavirus or COVID-19 normal. I think people will be expecting something different. There'll be a worry about who will be made to pay for the economic damage wrought by this virus. People in this country are still suffering the consequences of austerity, which was the government's response to the 2008 financial crash and ensuing global recession, and that was cuts to public services, swinging cuts to welfare, depression on wages, a lowering of taxes on the rich, feeling that would stimulate the economy, which it did, while it did the exact opposite. So the struggle will revolve around the political struggle. Who's going to pay for this economic damage wrought by the virus? It has to be the rich. The government during the last financial crisis bailed out the banks to the tune of over £1 trillion. If it can find money for bankers, it can find money for the real economy, for working men and women. This was not their fault. They did not create this virus, just as they were not responsible for the 2008 financial crash. So I think there'll be a new level of consciousness abroad in the country, and people will demand that they will not have to suffer the price of a virus that's not their fault, and an economy that's been configured up until now to meet the needs of the rich rather than the needs of the masses. That dynamic has to change. And if it doesn't change, I think you will see people on the street, because I don't think a lot of people are going to be minded to take any more of this Tory battering and bludgeoning in the name of the free market.